In the deep Appalachian mountains of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to ancient hillsides like secrets refusing to be told, a community existed that time seemed to have forgotten. The year was 1956, in the remote hollow known to locals as Blackwater Ridge. For nearly 7 generations, the Cunningham family had lived there in complete isolation. Winding through dense forests of oak and pine that seemed to swallow any outsider who dared venture too close, the dirt road leading to their homestead was barely passable. The nearest town, Harland, sat 23 miles away, a distance that might as well have been 1,000 for people who so rarely left their ancestral land. It was during a humid August evening at the local diner that Sheriff Thomas McKinley first heard whispers about the Cunninghams. An elderly mailman named Walter Briggs, his hands trembling as he clutched his coffee cup, spoke in hushed tones about what he had witnessed during a rare delivery attempt to that isolated family. "Sheriff, I seen things up there," Walter said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Things that ain't natural. Children who don't look like children should look. Faces twisted in ways that make your stomach turn. And the sounds, Lord help me, the sounds they make." Initially, Sheriff McKinley dismissed the claims as mountain folklore, the kind of exaggerated tales that spread through small communities like wildfire. But when over the following weeks 3 more witnesses came forward, each describing similar disturbing observations, he knew he could ignore the situation no longer. Ezekiel Cunningham, the family patriarch, was 72 years old in 1956. His family tree, if one could call it that, was less a tree and more a tangled vine that looped back upon itself repeatedly. A disturbing pattern was revealed by historical records from the county courthouse. Marriages between first cousins, uncles to nieces, and in some cases even closer relations that the law had somehow failed to prevent. The perfect conditions for this genetic catastrophe had been created by the isolation of Blackwater Ridge. Convincing them that outsiders were corrupted and that purity could only be maintained within bloodlines were the family's religious beliefs, rooted in a distorted interpretation of biblical teachings. This ideology, combined with geographical isolation and a deep-seated distrust of government authority, had transformed the Cunningham compound into a closed genetic pool spanning more than 150 years. The science behind what was happening in these mountain communities was explained by Dr. Helena Morrison, a physician from Lexington who had studied the effects of isolated populations. When blood relatives reproduce, she noted in a 1957 medical journal, the likelihood of recessive genetic disorders increases exponentially. With devastating consequences, traits that would normally remain hidden emerge. We're talking about severe physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and conditions that significantly reduce life expectancy. By September 1956, Sheriff McKinley had assembled enough testimonies to justify a welfare check. He recruited Deputy James Holbrook and social worker Margaret Anderson to accompany him on the treacherous journey to Blackwater Ridge. The date was September 14, a Friday that would be forever etched in their memories. Their 3-hour drive took them along increasingly narrow roads until they reached a point where the patrol car could go no further. They continued on foot, following a path barely visible through overgrown vegetation. The air grew thick with humidity and an unsettling silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. When they finally emerged into a clearing, the Cunningham homestead sprawled before them like something from a nightmare given physical form. 3 dilapidated structures leaned against each other as if seeking support, their wooden walls blackened by age and neglect. Like empty eye sockets, broken windows stared, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the mountain air. For the rest of their lives, what happened next would haunt them. As they approached the main house, a figure emerged from the shadows of the porch. It was a young person, approximately 12 years old based on body size, but their appearance defied natural human anatomy. Misshapen was the skull, elongated at the back and compressed at the front. On a face that seemed to lack proper bone structure beneath pale, translucent skin, eyes sat at uneven heights. The mouth, twisted and unable to fully close, revealed teeth growing at chaotic angles. Margaret Anderson gasped and stumbled backward, her professional training momentarily abandoning her in the face of such profound physical devastation. This child, later identified as Ruth Cunningham, was not alone. Within minutes, 6 more children emerged from various structures, each displaying severe physical abnormalities that spoke to generations of concentrated genetic material. One boy, approximately 8 years old, dragged a leg that had developed at the wrong angle from his hip. The bone was clearly visible through paper-thin skin covered in open wounds. Another child, a girl of perhaps 10, had eyes that bulged from shallow sockets. Her vision was clearly impaired as she navigated the world through sound and touch rather than sight. A third child possessed hands with only 3 fingers each, the digits fused together in a way that made even basic tasks impossibly difficult. Sheriff McKinley documented everything he could, though his hands shook as he wrote. From the main house emerged the Cunningham patriarch, Ezekiel, with a shotgun cradled in his arms, though he made no threatening gestures. His appearance, while less severe than the children, still bore the unmistakable marks of generational interbreeding, a protruding lower jaw that made speech difficult, ears positioned lower than normal, and a shuffling gait that suggested neurological complications. "You ain't welcome here," Ezekiel stated flatly, his words distorted by his malformed jaw. "This is our land, our family. We don't need no interference from town folk who don't understand our ways." The family's deep-rooted beliefs and their complete lack of understanding regarding the consequences of their isolation were revealed by the confrontation that followed. Ezekiel insisted that their way of life was ordained by their interpretation of Scripture, that keeping bloodlines pure was a form of holiness that the modern world had abandoned. Regaining her composure, Margaret Anderson attempted to explain the medical realities. "Mr. Cunningham, these children are suffering. Their conditions are direct results of close blood relations reproducing. They need medical attention, proper nutrition, and intervention that we can provide." But Ezekiel remained unmoved, his worldview so entrenched that even the evidence standing before him in the form of severely afflicted children could not penetrate his convictions. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the hollow, Sheriff McKinley made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events exposing one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation in American history. He radioed for backup and child protective services, knowing that what he had discovered in Blackwater Ridge could no longer remain hidden in the mountain fog. If you've watched until this point, you have witnessed one of the most tragic consequences of isolation and consanguinity ever documented in America. This is not just history. It is a reminder of what can happen when communities become too closed, when beliefs override science, and when children pay the price for ancestral choices. Because these stories need to be remembered, not hidden away, the Cunningham children deserve to be more than forgotten footnotes in medical journals. If Ruth's story has touched you, if her words have reached you, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here." So I can meet you and know who truly values the stories on this channel. These aren't just tales, they're testimonies of real human suffering that should never be repeated. Hit the like button if this story impacted you, and share it with others who need to understand why genetic diversity matters, why isolation is dangerous, and why we must never let ideology harm innocent children. Resources that the small town of Harlan had never before mobilized were required for the investigation into the Cunningham family. By late September 1956, a team of social workers, medical professionals, and law enforcement officers had converged on Blackwater Ridge, transforming the isolated hollow into a site of official scrutiny. Among the specialists brought in to assess the situation was Dr. Robert Kellerman, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky. His preliminary examinations of the Cunningham children revealed a catalog of disorders so extensive that he initially struggled to believe they all originated from a single family line. "What we're witnessing here," Dr. Kellerman explained to the assembled team on September 28, "is the cumulative effect of at least 6 generations of concentrated genetic material. The probability of recessive traits manifesting increases with each marriage between close relatives. By the time we reach these children, the damage is catastrophic and in most cases irreversible." The full extent of the tragedy was revealed by medical examinations conducted in a makeshift clinic established in the nearby town of Cumberland. Every single one of the 11 children identified at the Cunningham compound, ranging in age from 4 to 16, displayed severe physical and cognitive abnormalities. The eldest, a boy named Caleb Cunningham, was 16, but possessed the cognitive functioning of a 5-year-old. His spine was curved at such an extreme angle that he stood barely 4 feet tall. His rib cage was compressed against his internal organs in a way that made breathing a constant struggle. Having never developed proper speech capabilities, he communicated through grunts and simple gestures. Sarah Cunningham, 14, had been born with a cleft palate so severe that it split not just her lip, but extended through her nasal cavity. Multiple surgeries would have been required at birth to give her any chance at normal function. But she had received nothing, growing up in isolation. She had learned to eat only soft foods and communicated through a series of hand signals the family had developed. Even more heartbreaking cases were presented by the younger children. 5-year-old Joseph had microcephaly, his skull having failed to develop properly, leaving his brain compressed and his cognitive abilities severely limited. He spent most of his time rocking back and forth, occasionally crying out in a distress that no one could fully understand or alleviate. A clearer picture of the Cunningham family structure emerged as Dr. Kellerman compiled his findings. Researchers reconstructed a family tree that defied conventional genealogical mapping using county records, birth certificates when they existed, and testimonies from the few family members willing to speak. The product of a union between first cousins was Ezekiel Cunningham, the patriarch himself. His wife, Martha, who had passed away in 1954, was actually his niece, the daughter of his half-brother. Among themselves, their children had intermarried, creating a second generation of compounded genetic problems. The family tree had become so intertwined by the third and fourth generations that determining exact relationships became nearly impossible. That the Cunningham family had originally settled in Blackwater Ridge in 1803 was revealed by historical research. The remote location had been chosen by the founder, Jeremiah Cunningham, specifically to establish a religious community separate from what he viewed as the corrupting influences of mainstream society. His particular interpretation of religious texts emphasized bloodline purity and the rejection of outsider influence. For the first few generations, the community had included multiple unrelated families, allowing for genetic diversity. However, by the 1870s, conflicts over religious interpretation and leadership had driven away other families, leaving only the Cunninghams in the hollow. From that point forward, isolation became absolute. So normalized within the family had the pattern of intermarriage become by the early 1900s that it was no longer questioned. Children grew up knowing no other potential partners, and the family's religious teachings reinforced that marriage outside the bloodline was forbidden and sinful. Something that chilled everyone involved was also uncovered by the investigation: the Cunningham family burial ground. Located on a hillside behind the main compound, the cemetery contained far more graves than there were family members alive. The burial sites of children who had not survived infancy or early childhood were indicated by small markers, many nothing more than rough stones or wooden crosses. The social worker, Margaret Anderson, spent hours carefully documenting the cemetery. By her count, there were 47 small graves dating from 1880 to 1956. A devastating picture of genetic failure playing out over generations was painted by the mortality rate, given that only 11 children were currently alive at the compound. For every child we see living with severe deformities, Margaret noted in her report, there are likely 3 or 4 who didn't survive past birth or early childhood. The graves tell us that the family knew something was wrong, but their beliefs prevented them from seeking outside help or changing their practices. The psychological dimensions of their isolation were revealed in interviews with the adult Cunningham family members who had some capacity for communication. They spoke of their way of life as a sacred duty, of maintaining purity as a religious calling. When confronted with the suffering of their children, they rationalized it as tests of faith or consequences of sin, never making the connection to the biological reality of their intermarriage patterns. This mindset was clearly displayed by 38-year-old Rebecca Cunningham, Ezekiel's daughter, and also the mother of 3 of the afflicted children through a union with her uncle, during an interview on October 3. Her own physical abnormalities, including a severe underbite that gave her face a distorted appearance and a right arm that had developed significantly shorter than her left, did not shake her convictions. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she insisted, her speech difficult to understand through her malformed jaw. These children are precious in his sight. Their afflictions are part of his plan that we cannot fully understand. Rebecca became defensive and withdrawn when asked if she recognized that marriages between close-blood relatives caused these conditions. The concept simply did not align with the worldview she had inherited through generations of isolation and religious indoctrination. As October progressed, legal proceedings began to determine the fate of the Cunningham children. The state of Kentucky filed for emergency custody, arguing that the children required immediate medical intervention and that leaving them in the compound constituted severe neglect, even if unintentional. The removal was fought by the Cunningham family, represented by a court-appointed lawyer who struggled to communicate with his clients. Ezekiel testified that the government had no right to interfere with their religious practices and family structure. A collision between individual liberty, religious freedom, and the state's obligation to protect vulnerable children became the stage in the courtroom in Harlan. Judge Harold Simmons, who presided over the case, found himself in an unprecedented situation. On October 19, 1956, he issued a ruling that would change everything. The children would be removed from the Cunningham compound and placed in state care, where they would receive medical treatment and assessment. The ruling cited overwhelming evidence of physical harm and the family's inability or unwillingness to provide appropriate care. While this court respects religious freedom, Judge Simmons stated from the bench, that freedom cannot extend to practices that result in severe physical harm to children who have no choice in the matter. The evidence presented is clear and undeniable. Generational intermarriage has created conditions incompatible with basic human welfare. Traumatic for everyone involved was the removal process executed on October 23. The children, who had never left Blackwater Ridge, screamed and fought as they were carried to vehicles. Their family members wailed and called out, some threatening violence, though ultimately none materialized. The scene played out against the backdrop of autumn leaves falling from trees that had witnessed generations of this family's self-imposed isolation. With complex emotions, those involved in the removal process grappled as the convoy of vehicles descended the mountain road carrying the Cunningham children toward an uncertain future. They had saved these children from further neglect, but they had also torn them from the only world they had ever known, however dysfunctional that world might have been. Dr. Kellerman, riding in one of the vehicles with 3 of the younger children, looked at their frightened faces and felt the weight of what lay ahead. Medical interventions could address some of their physical problems, but the psychological damage and cognitive limitations would persist. The irrefutable evidence of their families' tragic choices would be borne in their bodies as these children spent the rest of their lives navigating a world they were profoundly unprepared for. The beginning of what medical staff would later describe as the most challenging case in the institution's history was marked by the arrival of the Cunningham children at the Kentucky State Hospital for Children in Louisville on October 24, 1956. A world completely foreign to their experience was entered by 11 children, ranging from 4 to 16 years old, each carrying the devastating physical manifestations of generational consanguinity. A team of specialists to assess and develop treatment plans for each child was assembled by Dr. Patricia Henshaw, the hospital's chief pediatrician. The initial evaluations took 3 full weeks and revealed complications that extended far beyond the visible physical deformities. "We're not just dealing with orthopedic issues or facial abnormalities," Dr. Henshaw explained to her team during a November meeting. "We're seeing systemic failures across multiple organ systems, hearts with structural defects, kidneys operating at reduced capacity, immune systems compromised to the point where minor infections become life-threatening. These children are biological case studies in what happens when genetic diversity is eliminated." The medical team's efforts became focused on 8-year-old Michael Cunningham. His condition represented the middle range of severity among the children, making him a candidate for interventions that might improve his quality of life. Born with a severe club foot, a cleft palate, and one eye significantly smaller than the other, Michael also suffered from frequent seizures that medications struggled to control. An attempt at corrective surgery on Michael's foot was made in November 1956 by the surgical team, led by Dr. Raymond Cooper. The procedure, which would have been routine in a normally developed child, became complicated by Michael's unusual bone density and abnormal tissue structure. Instead of the anticipated 3, the surgery took 7 hours, and his compromised immune system struggled to fight infections that prolonged recovery. Despite receiving the best medical care available in 1956, Michael's foot never achieved normal function. The underlying genetic issues had created structural abnormalities too profound for surgical correction. For the rest of his life, he would walk with a severe limp, requiring a specially designed brace that caused him constant discomfort. Even more challenging than the physical treatments proved the psychological adaptation. The Cunningham children had lived their entire lives in a small, isolated community where their appearances were normal within their family context. Suddenly thrust into a hospital environment where staff members struggled to hide their shock and other patients stared openly, the children retreated into themselves. For the first week, 15-year-old Anna Cunningham, whose facial structure was so distorted that speech was nearly impossible, refused to eat. She would sit in her hospital bed, tears streaming down her misshapen face, making anguished sounds that broke the hearts of even the most experienced nurses. She had been separated from her mother, who was also her aunt, and her father, who was her grandfather's brother. And no amount of gentle explanation could help her understand why. To work with the children, the hospital brought in Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a psychiatrist specializing in childhood trauma. Dr. Marsh quickly realized that traditional therapeutic approaches were insufficient for the unique challenges these children faced. They're experiencing multiple layers of trauma simultaneously, Dr. Marsh noted in her case files. The trauma of separation from family, the trauma of medical procedures, and perhaps most significantly, the dawning awareness that they are different from other people in ways that cannot be fixed. How do you help a child process that their very existence is the result of practices that society deems wrong? By December 1956, the children had been divided into different care facilities based on their needs. The most severely affected, including 4-year-old Joseph with his microcephaly and 7-year-old Ruth, whose multiple organ failures required constant monitoring, remained in hospital settings. Others, like Michael and Anna, were transitioned to a specialized care home in Frankfurt designed for children with significant disabilities. Willowbrook Home, the Frankfurt facility, became the long-term residence for 7 of the Cunningham children. The director, Mrs. Helen Crawford, had 30 years of experience working with children with disabilities, but even she found herself unprepared for the complexity of the Cunningham case. In all my years, Mrs. Crawford confided to a colleague in January 1957, I've never encountered children so profoundly damaged by choices made before they were even born. Every single one of them will require lifelong care. None of them will ever live independently or have anything approaching a normal life. Tirelessly, the staff at Willowbrook worked to provide the children with education appropriate to their cognitive levels. For some, like 16-year-old Caleb, this meant basic life skills, how to feed himself with adaptive utensils, how to indicate when he needed the bathroom, how to engage with simple toys. For others with slightly higher cognitive function, like 12-year-old Ruth, education included basic reading and number recognition. Progress was painfully slow and often heartbreaking. Ruth, despite her severe physical deformities, possessed more cognitive ability than most of her siblings. She could learn and remember, which meant she could also understand what she had lost and what she would never have. By her 13th birthday in June 1957, Ruth had learned enough about the outside world to recognize that her appearance made her unemployable, unmarriageable, and permanently dependent on institutional care. One afternoon in July 1957, Ruth sat with a speech therapist working on improving her limited verbal communication. Through great effort, she managed to form words that were barely comprehensible but unmistakable in their emotion. Why? She asked, tears streaming from her unevenly placed eyes. Why this way? The therapist, Mrs. Linda Peterson, had no adequate answer. How could she explain to a 13-year-old girl that her grandparents' had made choices that set in motion a genetic catastrophe spanning generations? How could she make Ruth understand concepts of genetic inheritance and recessive traits when the girl's education had been non-existent until 8 months ago? Now, I need you to do something. Think about Ruth's question. Think about those children who never chose their fate. If this story has moved you, if you feel the weight of what happened in Blackwater Ridge, type in the comments, why this way? Let Ruth's question echo beyond these mountains. Let it remind us all of the consequences of isolation and ignorance.